This is produced by Research Councils UK, this image, right? The economic and societal impact and academic impacts don't link up. Yeah, there are no connections made between these two things, right? And I think that's kind of one of the anxieties, that illustrates quite neatly what the anxieties that academics have about this issue, that in some ways we see ourselves as going in one direction and government going another. This is my fun picture. So as Maggie said, I'm head of the graduate school here, but I've also for the last year been head of an initiative called Arts Methods, which has been interested in training postgraduate students and cohort training, not subject-specific training. So giving training relating to career, training relating to teaching, and indeed just broadening kind of the way in which postgraduates might think. And one of the key things that that initiative does is try to get postgraduates to think outside of the academy and to think outside of Manchester. When I first did my first talk as Director of Arts Methods in September at an induction event, I talked about how when I did my PhD, I was publication native or publishing native, right? So that's what I thought I was, right? So my generation of scholars had the REE, what's now the REF, kind of already embedded in their mindset. And so therefore it was part of the DNA of their project that they would publish. And I think nearly, if you talk to any postgraduate student now, they're well aware that they need to publish stuff, they need to go to conferences, and to be part of that kind of conversation. And that's sort of fundamentally part of what you do as postgraduate students. And I think that for your generation of scholars, you have to think about being impact native. That basically impact has to be somewhere in your PhD project. The idea of it, the way that you might sort of develop your thoughts in that kind of nexus has to be ingrained. So part of what we do at Arts Methods is try and enhance that and help that out, right? Try to give you opportunities or students opportunities to think in different ways, think about different narratives they might talk about, and to maybe think about different audiences, right? Because to talk to people from performing arts is slightly different, I think. But particularly in some of the humanities subjects, the ideas of audiences outside of our discipline or outside of the academy and how one might talk to those audiences is kind of anathema in many ways. If you talk to a historian, particularly, I work on popular history, you talk to many historians, they don't think popular history is very worthy because they're worried about what happens to history when you do it in public. And the kind of way it might be degraded. And there's a sort of sense that academics do things properly, there's academic rigor, you're trained, etc., etc. This is what historians are, that's what they say. And that when you kind of dumb it down, when you water it down, it becomes something different, and that's quite dangerous. So there's quite a sort of set of issues about this. Why should you be impact native? What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of reason why impact is important, I think. And I'm going to go through quite quickly the actual processes for measuring this strange thing. Maggie's already talked about the research excellence framework, and I'm going to just give you a sort of sense of what we're being asked currently to prepare. The end of the census date for the RAF is next year, and we'll submit our RAF statements next year as departments or scholarly organisations. And I think it's quite useful for you to see just exactly what's being asked of us, right? Why is it important? It's important because we need to talk to publics. We need to think about publics outside of the academy. And I don't think this has anything to do with an economic agenda or changing society or making people's lives better. I think it's actually part of our moral duty as academics. We are, after all, interested in communication, we're interested in developing and enhancing understanding, and that fundamentally involves people who are not just our peers. So I would kind of argue that this is just a kind of strangely official version of what we should be doing anyway. And it has its kind of oddities, and that's what we might want to talk about today. But the idea that we might go out and talk to schools, the idea that we might talk to arts institutions, organisations beyond the academy, I don't think is at all a problem. In fact, it should be what we're up to. We are publicly funded, and that's kind of problematic in itself, but there is a kind of sense that we should be giving back to a community, having some social responsibility. And I think that we need to think about ourselves as academics if we think this is a problem. The way it's been imposed, we might argue, is a problem, and there is a great right, great anxiety among amongst the academic community about how this has been done. And we've been very under-consulted about it, for instance. But just the whole idea that we might engage with the public, we might try and widen participation with universities, seems to me obvious. I talked about the fact that I work on history. I wrote a book a couple of years ago about historical practice in public. Simon Sharma, David Starkey, historical film, etc., etc. It seems to me there's a massive swathe of stuff out there which we're not taking any notice of as historians in the academy. So in some ways, we need to, if we think if we're serious about what we do, we need to engage in these conversations and make them our own. Because what a lot of historians have done is kind of bitch about the fact that Simon Sharma is really famous, but haven't really contributed to anything else. So there's a kind of sense that he's doing it wrong, but we're doing it right, but we're not telling anyone about it. And that just seems to be the wrong way around. You should be more skilled in being able to talk to people. I mean, historians do tend to be kind of people who like to be in darkened rooms and not talk to other human beings. But they can get at them. There are any historians here. They asked the day if I was a historian. I was like, no. I write about historians. What else was it? So, where it's called impact public engagement, widening participation, transmission of knowledge transfer, all these things I think are fundamental to what we do as academics, and we need to attend to. Because of our social responsibility, because of a kind of sense of perceived elitism that universities still bedevil at universities. Most of my friends who went to university, most of my friends who went to this university, still think that I'm some kind of posh idiot talking to my peers, which at times is true. And we need to kind of break that down, I think, if we want people to come to universities and still think that universities are important, particularly in the arts and humanities. I think if you're winning a Nobel Prize for your work in graphene, or if you work in biochemistry, it's easier to demonstrate that your stuff is kind of important, right? Our stuff is more important, I would argue, but we have a very, very key problem of communication about it. Mainly because of the way we present ourselves oftentimes in the arts and humanities, but also there's a kind of perception of elitism, a perception that being academic is somehow problematic. Yeah? Most of the time when I come to this room, I come to see the events that are put on by the Centre for New Writing in the University of Manchester. Lots and lots of new authors, established authors, coming and talking, and near enough, every single one will say that they're not academic. And they get kind of upset when academics try to judge their work or have a kind of dialogue with them. They're very much not part of the academic community. Even those that teach creative writing are not part of what they see as being academic. Right? That's really problematic. These are people who should be our clear constituency, saying there's something problematic about what academics do. We're kind of strange in their eyes. Okay, anyway, that's enough of me kind of introducing. I've kind of gone through this is why impact has come up. I thought I'd just say that, evidently you all are thinking about this stuff because you're here. But I kind of wanted to just introduce some of these key things. Right? So why impact? I mean, impact, whilst it's being imposed by the coalition government, was actually not the coalition government's idea. So it's not necessarily a Tory policy. It's actually a policy which has emerged from years and years of auditing research at government level. But these agendas at the government level of demonstrating value for money, demonstrating the significance of work that is done in the academy that is publicly funded. This isn't just happening in the UK, it's happening across the Anglophone world and in Europe particularly. In the States not as much, but if you go to Australia, for instance, you get similar kind of arguments going on, much more problematic arguments given how the Australian government has kind of interfered in Australian academic life. So developing agendas, economic viability, as Maggie said, we are just about to become private businesses really, as universities. And this is one way we can kind of show everyone who's involved in that, everyone who's a stakeholder in that, what we do is right and worthy of continued funding. Public engagement, public discussion, involvement, I mean this has always been something that I think we should be doing and I think we should be keen on, but we need to enhance how we show it, I think, more than anything else, or how we judge it. But too often, I talk to quite a lot of my colleagues, and they, their ideas of public engagement are basically going out and giving a lecture to some people in library and so forth. Which is great, which is the way we teach at university, kind of demonstrative of the way in which we do certain things. So it's not really public engagement, it's public telling, which is not how we would teach, right? So it's kind of a very odd way of thinking about yourself in public. Widening participation, one of the things that impact has that no one's really thought about as much within the impact agenda, which I think is really obvious, is that influencing schools is really key. Right? The way in which the subject is taught, the way in which something is taught at school level. And no one really has done much work on how we might do this. But I think this is kind of key. And also just improving the kind of visibility of universities in public life, but particularly at school level. And we've got to demonstrate the value of publicly funded research. Hefty had a series of workshops. This is what came out of them. Hefty is the people who give us the money, right? Those people who are asking us to do all this. So when the idea of impact came about, they started putting together this set of workshops to work out how they might audit or judge impact. These are the three kind of key findings. One, that there will be case studies, right? So if you're thinking about how you will work in the future in terms of impact, one of the things that seems to be the case is that it can't just be kind of scattergun. I've done this one little thing here, I've done this here, I've done this here. It has to be in some ways kind of measurable as a case study, as a kind of as a project. Yeah. I mean, sometimes you can put people together doing that, but it's actually relatively rare. So think about that. I mean, think about a kind of a holistic, sense of what your impact might be. Guidance. There's a lot of guidance about what impact is. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of quite conflicting guidance. But we need to be quite careful about thinking what we think impact is and thinking what other constituencies think impact is. This is my favourite one. There'll be behavioural consequences, which is a kind of real management way of saying we will change what we do. It's clear already, and what I'm talking to you about being impact native, it will shift the way you think about research. One of the reasons it's being imposed is it's meant to make the arts and humanities more similar to the sciences, where collaborative work, for instance, is much more common, where public engagement work is much more common. But it will shift the way in which people work, research, the way in which people are hired, the way in which people get jobs, postdoctoral jobs, postgraduate work. I mean, all this stuff will start very, very quickly to have a kind of a clear effect on the way in which people work at university. Sorry, I should have said at the beginning, if you've got any questions about this stuff, say am I out of time? Good, no, it's fine. So if you've got any questions whilst I'm going on. These workshops also demonstrated that different disciplines would have different kinds of ways of measuring impact, which I think is kind of brilliant. One here is from performing arts and one here is from social sciences. Performing arts are interested in creating partnerships, creating kind of relationships between audiences and researchers, whereas social sciences is much more interested in forming public debate, in contributing to a kind of public discussion, oftentimes at disagreeing with government policy, and that creating this kind of sense of entitlement and enfranchisement for an audience. But as you can see, both these, whilst they're both kind of different in what they're looking to do, they're both about enhancing the experience of the audience, or of the outside set of peoples, and bringing them into some kind of partnership, some kind of relationship, which is much more equitable than we might think it is right now. Right, how it works. This is like fundamentally what you do next year, what we do next year when we submit our case study. You have to have a set of underpinning research, right? So the research has to have been done. And the research cannot have been done in order to make impact happen. This is the kind of fun thing, right? You can't say, I want to change this, so therefore I'm going to do some research here in order to change that. Yeah, the research has to somehow kind of be modelled on change, but not actually to change. Which I'm going to cover. This is the kind of double speak that actually does come up quite a lot in it. So you have to demonstrate you've done underpinning research. You've actually done some research. It has to come from research. It can't just be, we decided to change something. You have to then demonstrate how that research has had any kind of impact or benefit. The reach of it, the significance of it, and it then indicators how you can actually judge and observe how the demonstrable impact that this has had. And these are the kind of things that are more controversial than anything else. Because actually, as Maggie said, we can't do that very easily. You can go into a room and talk to people about Kant, and then at the end ask them whether they've changed their ideas about Kant, I guess. But that isn't really a very good way of judging anything. And then you need references to demonstrate and corroborate. So it's quite, in comparison to just submitting your book and saying, this is my book, I wrote it, tell me whether it's any good or not, this is quite a kind of technocratic way of thinking about what we do as researchers and judging it, right? But in terms of being impact native, in terms of thinking about your work in the future, bear in mind that this is the kind of stuff that you're going to be judged by. Yeah? This is the kind of way in which you're going to have to be able to present yourself. Yeah? So when you're writing, covering letters for jobs, for instance, if you can kind of look like you're doing something like this, that's quite useful, or at least if you've got the vocabulary. And these, finally, are some examples. These are so there was a case study project last year, and a certain number of institutions around the country submitted some as a kind of pack. And these are from a range of institutions, new institutions, old institutions, from English language and literature, which is my subject. Just to give you a sort of sense of the range that is available, right? Rob McFarlane, does everyone know Rob McFarlane? He's kind of a public intellectual who wrote Mountains of the Mind and The Wild Places. And he's basically been presented as a public intellectual. That's his impact. That people have read his books and they have changed their minds about things. Well, that's from the University of Cambridge, which kind of says certain things about what they think impact is. It was well marked, and it's interesting because it's like, well, do we all then just have to become public intellectuals? That's kind of interesting. Well, a brilliant, generous scholar, and very unique. It is unique, but the idea of what he's doing is kind of cool. The other interesting thing about Rob is that he was hated at Cambridge for about 5 years. They tried to sack him, and then Impact happened. He's now their kind of golden boy. Well, that's a little bit of gossip. Henry VIII at Hampton Court. This was about performance and about engaging audiences at Hampton Court. It was a celebration of a centenary, and it was also some money that was funded by a knowledge transfer fund from the HRC. The impact of literary research and informing policy making, you can see how these are kind of very, very, very different projects. Some of them are about research, very much the heavy research there. Some of them are about the way in which something can change policy or practice or behaviour. Public understanding of poetry. This is a really vague one. This is a set of kind of events where people kind of talked about poetry, and someone was on the radio a bit. It's not a very strong case, I think. And then creating education and commercial access to English language resources. This is one of the things that Impact does, we might do more of, is this kind of thing, which is creating teaching resources, creating educational resources. So what you do is you kind of say, well, this is our work, but actually it shouldn't just happen in isolation. We should find ways of communicating it to different audiences. And of all of these, I think this is the most pure in its kind of impact nature. It's more scientific apart from anything else. It looks like a project. It did quite well when it was marked. I mean, you might not think this is what you want to be doing in your life, but if you can find a way of kind of transposing that into your own research, then I think you'll be most of the way to being able to do this type of thing. All right, I'm going to be quiet. And so, are there any questions?
Can I just add something to what you were saying, which is that when you go for a job interview these days, for a job, 10, 15 years ago, you'd be asked to, tell about your research and what kind of research you're doing and how is that impacting on the field, and ask you to look inwards. Now, you will be asked what's the significance of your research, and you will be expected to articulate that significance within this kind of impact-savvy framework. So that's the difference between my generation, Jerome's generation, and your generation if you go into academic work. And you can't just say, I go and speak publicly, or if you say that a lot of my work's been taken on in schools, you have to evidence that. Now, in an interview situation, that's very anxiety inducing, but that's what they're asking now. So when, you know, it's like when you go to an interview and they say, would you take the job if you were offered it? You think, oh, they're offering me the job, but they're not. They're saying, would you take it if you offered it? But when they're asking you about the significance of your research, they really need you to be able to articulate it in these terms. And
but also in a kind of realistic way. I mean,
yeah.
I think particularly at interview level, but or when you're introducing your work in a covering letter, demonstrating that you know what is going on makes so much sense. Saying that you completely transform the lives of 500 people in a small Merseyside town, not so much, but you need to at least be able to talk the language,
Yeah.
have the vocabulary of this kind of thing.
And I have a friend who is a scientist, and you know, their partner has worked in the humanities, and their partner always says, yes, you might be working on a cure for cancer, but you haven't actually found one. But at least they can articulate the research in those terms, and I think that's really important to take on board.
And Manchester has two of the most sort of famous public intellectuals in the world. Joseph Stiglitz, who's Nobel Prize winning economics professor, and scientist now.
Brian Cox.
Brian Cox. Yeah, these are two figures who do that very well. They kind of go, here is how stuff works. This is what we've thought about in this kind of research. So, and they take two very abstruse and quite complex, quite difficult subjects and do that brilliantly. And I think that's kind of a gift, really. Is anyone, I mean, are you all here, so that means you're probably kind of quite keen on this as a set idea, or at least finding out about it. Is anyone going to kind of counter this with a kind of, well, this is complete rubbish, why are we being asked to do this? Which,
I don't think it's complete rubbish, but coming from a teaching background for 11 years, I feel like I've come from a situation where we're being constantly asked to justify what the impact is. So when I hear some of this, I'm like, yeah, that's where I think I've come from. So I don't.
And what do you think that's been beneficial for the students, or do you think that's been?
Yeah, I think a lot of times in lessons, the whole thing is this idea of the learning line, progress they've made, what do they know before they came in the door, what do they know at this point, and what do they know at the end, and I think that has improved teaching, and I think it makes the learning overt to the young people. It makes you think a lot harder about what you're doing and the value of what you're doing, so I think it has improved things, but you sort of feel like you're constantly having to justify what you do, and sometimes that takes away a bit of the creativity of it. But then with this, you know, about funding, about money, it's important to do things properly. And then the other side of it is, in some arts projects, people are getting given money and what they're doing isn't good enough. So people need to be, I hate this word, held accountable. I don't know what the court is that I'll be taking them to, but there needs to be, when you phone up the Arts Council and ask them if they've got, you know, a framework for measuring things, they sort of go, well, we asked someone to do an evaluation, and you're like, well, that's not good enough. So.
I think you're right, but I'd argue that actually there are institutions outside the university that are well ahead of the game.
Yeah.
Schools, well, yeah, certainly. But I went to an impact workshop for CQ, which is about this, which is University English kind of organisation. And the people that had speaking working in the Arts Council were from museums and were from the BBC, all of whom are within our kind of disciplinary network. All of whom are very good at saying, this is how I can judge why this has been a success or not. Certainly museums. I mean, museums are streets ahead of us in terms of saying there's the educational value there, here are the number of people who come through the door, this is how I changed this. They're brilliant at it. The BBC are very good at kind of saying, well, we've had to justify this for years and years and years and years and years. So we're very good at sort of putting a value on arts production. And the Arts Council, I think you're right, the Arts Council is becoming more precise about this. It is very difficult. But the Arts Council, it also has frameworks for saying this is why we fund an organisation, this is why we don't fund an organisation. This is what makes a good arts project grow. And they have, you know, a range of reference.
But once the project's finished, that they decide about who they're going to allocate money to, but then once the project's over, the sort of, when you talk about transferring knowledge and reaching, you know, wider audiences, I think that's the bit maybe that's missing. So once you've got the money, you're up and running, you're doing your thing, aren't you? But then afterwards, it's like...
That's a strange organisation. Well, yeah, no, you're right. But you're right for for discrete projects, but if you're a regularly funded organisation, like a festival or a theatre or something, I think you are better at being able to audit and stuff. But that's more like anyway, you're not talking about sort of particular